As a thank you for supporting us on Patreon, we like to put together some tutorials as we can. And I have seen this question recently about developing seminar questions. So I decided to put together a quick tutorial on the art of developing a good seminar. And this is just a very brief overview of some basic principles. And before starting a seminar, I always review with a class the rules for civil discourse, which I recommend teachers have put up in their classroom, and also give them some conversation stems for how to address one another during seminar. I also would make sure that the room is set up for conversation and the kids are very clear in understanding what all of our rules are, which we go over a lot in our classrooms. So the purpose for this tutorial, though, is not to give a tutorial about how to set up your classroom for a seminar, but really just a brief overview of the basic principles of the types of questions you would ask during a seminar. So the basic seminar question outline typically is your opening questions. Usually you just have one opening question and then 3 core questions and a closing question. So the opening question usually is more of a maieutic question. And by maieutic, that means it's a Socratic, it's in one of his dialogues, and he uses the term maieutic in reference to midwifery, which means a midwife is a coach. So these maieutic questions are more open-ended questions that promote a sense of wonder. Maieutic questions are a type of Socratic question that's purpose is really to gain more knowledge and understanding in order to then get closer towards a more precise idea. So since we're not really looking for precise idea in the opening question, the purpose is just to evoke interest and wonder to the text, to whet the appetite. Now, the core questions are going to get more into the analytical ideas within the text, analyzing. And usually I like to have 3 questions. Often, if the seminar is going really well, I only ever have to ask one of the 3 because the students, if you develop good questions, the natural conversation of the students usually goes into those other questions naturally. They actually start asking these questions of each other because that first core question should lead them to asking more questions. And often the students will come up with those questions and you don't even have to throw them out there. Often I'll have to throw them out there if I'm with a group of people that are shy or apprehensive or seminars new to them. But students who are used to doing seminar or are, if you have a classroom who's eager to talk and exchange ideas, often you only have to throw out one of the 3 questions, but it's good to have 3 in your back pocket. And during this process, the teacher is just posing questions to help them discuss part of the text. In all of the seminar, one of the biggest rules is that you are acting as a coach. You are not participating in answering any of the questions ever. And the closing question, I usually just do one again. This question should be a response that kind of helps students consider an application of the idea. It sometimes is also designed to make it more personal. So your opening question, typically start by asking one, and it's going to guide them towards awakening wonder or discovering a main idea. Let's say you want to do a seminar style discussion with a painting, a picture study. Now, often I'll do narrations for picture studies, but let's say we've maybe narrated a picture once, and now this time we're going to do a seminar with a picture. So the students are going to look at a Renoir painting called The Luncheon of the Boating Party. To awaken interest, in wonder, you could ask many wonder questions, but it's best to just choose and ask only one. So I would pass out copies of the painting, and I always have rules about how to handle our paintings so we can, use them again for other classes. Then I would ask the whole class an opening question. I would ask something like, what's your first impression of the painting? And how does the artist evoke your response? So I would just toss that out there like that. And I know that sounded like 2 questions, but if you think about it, the second question is a subcategory of the first one. So let me say them again. What is your first impression of this painting? And how does the artist evoke your response? So be thinking about that for a minute. And sometimes I'll repeat it. What is your first impression of the painting? And how does the artist evoke this response? You toss it out there like a ball and you let there be silence. Somebody will start. I promise you, somebody will start. And when they do, other students will start to respond to it and they'll share, what they felt and often these first opening questions are because they're kind of personal, like what's your first impression of the painting? People actually like to share those things. So just be quiet and remember you're not part of the discussion. Now, one of the things that's important to know, if the students start looking at you to tell the answers, step aside, try to make yourself unnoticed. Don't be in the center of the conversation. Remind the students this is a conversation for them to have with each other, not with you. They don't need to look to you for any answers or responses. They are talking to each other. So you can gently remind them, okay, guys, you're looking at me, look at each other. This is your conversation. And they'll respond pretty well to that. Another wonder question that could be a good opening would be something like, what are some adjectives you would use to describe this painting and explain why? See, now that seminar question could be great if you're going to be having them do a written response and you want them to focus on using adjectives. And if then after they're done looking at the painting, they could write a narration of this painting and you could require them to use at least 3 adjectives in their written narration. I've seen that done in 2nd and 3rd grade classrooms. So that's just an idea. So now the core questions. Again, typically we have 3 core questions ready. This is more analytical in nature to help students discover the truth and enter into a deeper dialogue. So if you remember, the first question was more synthetic. It was a whole picture approach, the opposite of analyzing. Now we're going to get into some really interesting analytical questions. So let's return to our painting. And I will throw out a few core questions. Now, this is different with students than the way I'm going to explain it to you because you would be experiencing it. But what we're going to do is I'm going to ask the first question. I want you to think about it for a minute. And then I'm going to go on to some of the other questions I would ask. We could ask, how does Renoir use movement in this painting? But that question is a bit leading. It's not a bad question, but if it were me, I would ask one that's a little less leading. I would ask something like, explain what is happening in this painting. Now, what will happen when you ask a question that's not necessarily focused on movement, but you just say, tell what's happening in this painting, is that inevitably the idea of movement will probably come up. So I would ask a more non-specific question to allow some ideas to come up, because honestly, sometimes even if you thought it was important to maybe bring up movement, you're going to be surprised that sometimes the students are going to bring up an idea that you had never even considered. And if they do, and it's a great idea, go with that and let it happen. So now, when they notice there's movement, if that's kind of something you were wanting to get at, so you could expand on that and you could say, okay, so there's movement in this picture. If the students aren't really expanding on it, you could say, well, how does Renoir show movement? So those kinds of questions I put out only if my students are not really getting into a good conversation. But again, you have to allow a lot of time for silence. They have to get used to the silence. And what will happen is over time, the silence moments will become less and less. So that first question, explain what is happening in this painting. Let it go. It's going to go crazy. And then what will happen is, if the conversation isn't really picking up within a few minutes and going, then you throw out the second question. The second question, I would ask something like, how is this painting similar and how is it different than another Renoir painting? I would ask that if we had maybe studied a Renoir painting and narrated a Renoir painting. Okay. Or if we hadn't done that, I might ask, what is your emotional reaction to the activities in this painting and why? Now, again, when we said explain what is happening in this painting, they might actually already have gone to that question. What is your emotional reaction to activities in this painting and why? You might not need to ask it. So your job is to pay very close attention to how the conversation is going and looking at the core questions you have developed to see if you even need to ask them, because it could be redundant if it's already been discussed. So if I were an art teacher and I were doing this and I wanted to get the students to know a specific art technique that they have already learned about in this painting, I would ask something about that. Another type of analytical core question that you could ask would be, what do you think is the most important detail in this painting and why? So basically my three core questions, just to review: explain what is happening in this painting. What is your emotional reaction to the activities in this painting and why? And what do you think is the most important detail in this painting and why? These types of questions will force analysis and great discussion. They will lead students towards empathy, attending carefully, and noticing details. So the closing question is typically just one core question, another one question again. Sorry, it's not a core question, a closing question. This is typically to help students respond and apply a core idea. So we'll go back to our painting and we'll close with a closing question. I think an idea that this painting conveys is that people enjoy communing together. That's me as a teacher stepping back and looking at it. And when you're developing your questions, you actually do need to think about it. Think about what would be some good questions. And for me, because I'm seeing communing together as a theme, I would want maybe my closing question to be gearing the kids to think that way or the students to think that way. Now, again, though, the conversation may have already flipped to go a different direction. As long as that direction isn't rude or out of line, you need to go ahead and let that direction happen. So I would probably ask maybe a question, something like, tell about a time in your life when you attended a gathering like this. When the students start telling their experiences, the idea of communicating and communing together is naturally going to unfold. If you want to evoke a deeper ending to this seminar, I would maybe ask something like, what does this painting tell us about people? That actually might get the kids even more towards the idea of communication being important. It might bring out a core idea about human interactions and make students really think about human nature. Some easier and more general questions for closing could be something like, if you could be in this painting, tell us about your experience. What do you do? What do you smell? What do you see? And what do you hear? That's kind of could be redundant if that was answered in the first question. So you need to make sure your closing question is a little bit different than your opening question. So I usually just have two closing questions ready, but I always only ask one. So, but I typically like to have two in case my question has already been answered during the seminar. So just to recap this, the closing questions that you could ask would be something like, tell about a time in your life when you attended a gathering like this, or what does this painting tell us about people? Or if you could be in this painting, tell us about your experience. What would you do, see, smell, or hear? That last question could be excellent, especially for if you have a group of people who are don't like to talk a whole lot, because it connects to the five senses, and that allows a little bit of a safer experience. It's a little easier to answer, I think, especially for little kids. So thank you for your support on Patreon. I really hope that this was helpful. And if you have any questions, you can always email me at beautifulteaching@gmail.com. And I'm thinking about doing a 1.5 to 2 hour seminar class, reading some really great text. If you're interested in that, let me know. If I do offer something like that, it'll probably be in the fall. So just let me know. Stay in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.